So what I was going to say about the presentations which we heard today from the regions, for which I am extremely grateful to all the people who came and contributed to them. What struck me were two particular things. One of them was that we heard from three regions whose processes were at very different stages. So one of them is still weaving it together, and that's Graham in the Ruamahanga, and going through that process of integration of knowledge. One of them is kind of in the slot, in the chute. We're on the verge of having to produce, and that panic, which is well familiar to all of us who've been engaged in collaborative processes, is there any way on God's earth that we're going to be able to reach an agreement? And one of them, Cairns, where they've achieved that relative calm of having actually got to the end of the process. So that's one interesting way of thinking about these three processes. And another one is the ways in which they've brought knowledge together and integrated it, whether they're doing it at the beginning of the process through the weaving process that Graham was talking about, whether they're doing it through a group of scientists, and a kind of integrated process. Maybe we didn't have time to explore this through the supervisory committee at the end, and I don't have the slide in front of me, so I'm not describing this as well as I should. So there are interesting questions about integration and how it's done. And I'd just like to leave those two thoughts on the table as things that we can continue to roll our minds about as we think about collaborative processes.
I'd like to just start off by grabbing Dave O'Connell before he disappears, get his early flight. And the reason I want David to give me some assistance here is it comes back to the question I think Guy raised about there wasn't really a science problem with Te Waihora. There was actually a science problem with Te Waihora, and it relates to something that Corina mentioned about land coming first and water second. The problem in Te Waihora was that water was first, and the real problem the scientists were faced with was how on earth do we go in that lake from one of the most polluted lakes in the country, recognised, down to a TLI, which is a trophic lake index, for those of you who don't know. It's a state of the trophic state of the lake, down to a TLI of something like 5. It just looked like an impossible target, and the science brains was around the table thinking, how the hell are we going to do this? With the sort of time frames that we've been driving along with all this change. And essentially we were rescued by Ngāi Tahu, and I just wanted David to tell us a little bit about the expectations of iwi in this context, which actually saved a lot of the science dilemmas.
Kia ora, Clive, thanks for that query. And I mean, this view from iwi won't be new to those that will remember the conversation around the LAWF small group early on in our deliberations, and particularly delivered by our former colleague Dean Stebbing, where iwi did introduce the intergenerational thinking to the table, because of course we were fixated on we need to fix it here and now and fix it quick, and I guess one of the things that iwi often bring to the table is that intergenerational outlook, which I think is slowly seeping into the psyche of wider New Zealand. That 10-year planning processes aren't going to solve problems. We need to think and act in much larger timescales. Of course, for Te Waihora, as Clive and I were reflecting, Mark Solomon said, it's taken over 150 years to get it to the state of being the largest, most polluted lake in the country. It's going to take us a heck of a lot of time to fix it. And as long as we start the journey now, and we're committed towards an outcome that is about restoring it, then at a point in time in the future we will get there. But it is about solid and continuous commitment, not trying to find a quick win. And that, we talked about that at Lorth, and I was interested, without sort of, how these conversations flow down. And recently at Taumutu we participated in a series that Māori TV did around Māori science initiatives that are happening, and Whakaora Te Waihora featured in episode 6 if you want to go and have a look at it. It's called Whenua, Project Whenua, I think. And one of our aunties, Auntie Marg Jones, sits there in her chair, and she says, I'd love to see the lake in a state that I remember swimming in it as a girl, but I know that I'm not going to get that. Maybe my great-great-grandchildren will have that opportunity in their lifetime. So, the saying that's just inherent in, I guess, the psyche and the outlook. And yeah, as I say, the importance of having a commitment to that long-term outcome and getting the wins. That's not to say, though, that in the zone committee, there were some of the Ngaitahu aunties were hugely frustrated with the fact that there's another 30 years of degradation of nitrate contamination in the post before we get to the point of trying to stabilise the situation and get it on a journey to recovery. So for them and the generation now, and even for me, hugely frustrating that you can't do anything in a big sense. But the small things, getting the creek behind the marae fenced, and as I was saying in the break, one of my nieces turning to me on Friday night when we were out eeling and saying to me, "Uncle, the water's clearer than it has been in other years when we've been out eeling." That to me is just one thing that tells me we're on that journey. Kia ora.
Right, I've got one other sort of general concept to make before I just bring up a few science points that were raised really by the group, and that relates to the whole issue that we've had quite a bit of discussion on, and that is, Ken used the term interdisciplinarity, and we've heard about trust and so on. And I just recall way back in the days when I worked for the DSIR in the 1970s, we were a government agency, and all we did was we supplied information as a group of elite, maybe, scientists to government, and that was it. We had the forensic division, and we had the water and soil division, and so on and so forth, and we just gave advice. The game, as you've heard now, is massively different, and it really has changed in the last decade. And so now there's the whole issue faced by the science community of operating in an environment which is a little bit uncomfortable, but it's probably also uncomfortable for people on the other side as well. And so I've actually corralled two people at afternoon tea to give me a hand with this. And the first one is Graham, who's sitting on the side of a regional council person, making sure that, as you heard this morning, he's got the knowledge that he needs around the table in a consultative fashion, and the kind of challenges with that. And then I've asked Dave Hamilton to give us a talk from the point of view of a distinguished scientist. Dave was ex-chairman of the Freshwater Sciences Society and so on, so he's got a very broad kind of feel across the country of suddenly, as a professional scientist, also sitting in on this process. So I'll ask Graham to come up first, and then Dave.
Okay, Clive asked me, because I've spent the last probably 10 years working around, what are some of the mixes of science that is actually needed to provide better information for the decision-making processes. And myself and Ken earlier this morning, I mentioned transdisciplinarity, which takes at least 2 years to be able to pronounce properly. But it actually is starting to get, it actually probably epitomises where we're trying to go. We're actually trying to bridge a number of knowledge systems together to actually provide a more complete picture of what's happening. So, you know, in this room today, we probably would have thought about the sciences and the mixture of sciences that actually all come together to actually answer that. Well, if you really embrace transdisciplinarity, there's actually a number of other information sources that come there that you have to bridge across. So, what's been quite interesting in the 2 years we've been undertaking our reviewing our science process is actually bringing the scientists together and giving some comfort that we're not all trying to turn them into systems thinkers. Because a lot of them are actually very good in their own discipline, and they actually spend a lifetime working on particular areas, which is extremely important. It's how you actually have that continuum of knowledge systems and information sources, because we can do what many, I think, government organisations done in the past. They've jumped from one end to another, so all of a sudden you're in a non-contestable science space, and then 5 years later in a contestable science space, and you have a lot of fallout as a result of that. So now we're entering into how do you actually move now into the future with the right mix of people. So that's actually, I guess, caused a bit of consternation amongst some of the scientists, as they think they're actually no longer going to be valid or able to actually represent the area properly, but that's actually, I think, shifted, and certainly the Greater Wellington's process over the last year has identified actually the collective makes some really good science and able to actually provide that information for those decisions, and it's also been able to get around some of the problems where there was a lot of disagreement around certain things, and a lot of that is that one model feeding into a model, they might be at different spatial time scales, and that's actually been quite difficult. But when you're actually sitting around the table full of people that are not actually in the same related discipline, we've started to solve a lot of really interesting puzzles. Groundwater people actually can influence how the ecologists think quite a lot about processes, and we've seen that come through. So that's actually been very good. So it's something that we're trying to ensure we promote without actually transforming everybody into transdisciplinarists.
So Clive asked me to say a little bit as President of New Zealand Freshwater Sciences Society. That was over 4 years, and I've just handed over the reins to Mark Schellenberg, who's sitting on my right over there. And the New Zealand Freshwater Sciences Society is a group of about 450 scientists from around New Zealand. As many of you are aware, they often have quite diverse and sometimes polarising viewpoints. And in some ways, I think some of the challenges of being president and being able to represent the society are some of the challenges faced by the Land and Water Forum in terms of consensus building and being able to come to a consensus when, in particular, especially in the freshwater area, the media in particular was always wanting to get comment when there were major sort of challenges in freshwater. And I guess my take on it was, to some extent, that we were usually required to put out media statements within 12 or 24 hours. Sometimes I had very little ability to gain consensus. I had to put out largely write a statement, and non-comment was interpreted as, I guess, neutrality or support. Not always, but we managed to generally refine statements that I think I would like to think was somewhat influential in the debate. For example, one of those was around the linkage of land to water, and in particular, following Clive Howard-Williams' talk a couple of years ago at a combined freshwater marine sciences conference, was the linkage of freshwater to estuaries and into the ocean, and being able to make that sort of a connection. And so in those terms, it also tends to divide itself into two areas, really. I guess one of those is the reductionists, and that's an essential part of the science. And often they're the younger people, simply because the systems thinking requires a lot of just shared knowledge and information to be able to support that system level thinking. They tend to be experimental. They're essential in many cases to validate some of the weakest components in a systems picture, and often they need to be targeted. How do we target the experimental work? Well, it's often with the systems thinkers and some of the models. The systems thinkers and the models actually help us to identify the weakest points, the least known and critical or tipping points, and to be able to do work around those that might be informed by the reductionists. So the two work very much hand in hand. The systems thinkers also put you into a very difficult domain in some ways, because some of the outputs of the models are very relevant to society and to decision makers. And I think that they're also seen in some case, or they need to be, as John discussed this morning, an honest broker or filter for information, but at the same time they're put into that public domain, and it's a difficult area to be in. They may be asked by media for information, and I think to some extent they have the right to do so. They're able to bring a level of neutrality, to do so from the point of view of the best source of available information based on some of those systems model outputs. I just wanted to finish by saying a little bit around uncertainty and how we might communicate uncertainty. I've heard it many times, not so much recently, but many times before. We'll collect the information, we'll collect the data, and we'll run a model at the end of the process. It just doesn't work that way, I'm sorry. We need to engage those models early on in the process to be able to help and assist some of the reductionist strategies, to be able to inform along the way, and to be able to produce outputs to the decision makers along the way. That enables them to gain a level of knowledge of uncertainty about the models, about the grey areas, about the critical areas for further information. John, and I'll just pick out some sort of key comments that I really liked from today's talks. John talked about lines being drawn with crayons and not with computer sharp lines, and that's a valid point around some of that uncertainty. And we should, from Ken's analysis, talk about probabilities perhaps rather than certainties. And last, I guess, when taking numbers and painting pictures, we're really painting pictures of plausible futures. So the output of these numerical models is often actual numbers, numerical values. How do we then take those numbers, put them into what's relevant to us, which might be NOF limits. It might be, for example, what are the implications on Mahinga Kai? What are the implications for the way that we interact with different systems? So I've sort of partly addressed Clive's question, I think, but maybe a few comments on the modelling as well.
Right, so I just made notes of the questions that I thought I needed to reflect back to the science community, probably through Mark Schellenberg as President of Freshwater Sciences, plus to my CRI and university colleagues anyway. And I'm just going to pull out 5 of them. Dave has already dealt with uncertainty. There are a whole lot of them, but these are ones that I've just ticked off right now for the kind of thing that I want to transfer across. One of them involves the load to come. And there were several questions about the load to come, and currently it's generally at local scale. Can we scale that up to regional and even national scale? There's some big issues here with that load to come and the wall of nitrogen that we've heard coming through and so on. The other big area that involved quite a bit of discussion was about mitigations, and can we encompass mitigations in land use models and the extent to which we do that. And I learned something from Richard that I didn't actually quite appreciate before his talk yesterday, and that is that there are very few mitigations to cover E. coli. And this is fundamental when we think of the desire by the communities to have swimmable rivers. And when we just put that in the context of maintain and improve, if we actually don't have mitigations, enough mitigation to actually go along that line, I'm not quite sure how that's going to be addressed. So this is a big challenge for the science community, is mitigations for E. coli. The other one was, how do we consider mitigations at a catchment scale as opposed to just locally on a farm and expanding up? And that was a couple of questions that came up from that, which I thought we really needed to address as scientists. The other area that came out fairly strongly, and we heard it today as well, from Graham talking about Wellington, Ken talking about the West Melton Christchurch, and Martin Neal's talk yesterday in Auckland, is this whole area of the difficulty of urban environments. 82%, or is it 90? 87%, I think, of New Zealanders live in an urban environment, and 52% live in 3 big cities. And yet, we're just not meeting the NPS requirements in those areas for most of the population of New Zealand are being affected that way. So that's a big area I think we need to address. And the other one I'm just going to touch on now is a lot more information on leaching rates, nutrient loss from the land. We've heard quite a bit of discussion about overseer. I was very impressed with Linda's talk yesterday about the extent to which we've come on soil mapping. Ian, I think, still wants us to go down to 1 to 100 scale as opposed to 1 to 25,000 scale. But still, I think we're getting that way, and that link, working back from Karina's example, let's go from water back to land, we are going to need that kind of scale of mapping, I think, to produce the mitigations and to produce the land use changes that we need to look after water.
The final point that I was going to make is a couple of years, 3 years ago maybe, before we embarked on our second and third reports, on our second mandate, we commissioned a paper on N and P and the relationship between them, the circumstances in which you could consider one of them to be limiting and the other not. It's an important and continually recurring issue, and we heard a elaborated discussion about it yesterday, and I would like to think that we could ask Scott if he would rework that paper with his colleagues and bring it back to us to put it through the usual conversations here. I think that would be a very useful thing to have on our website, maybe even slightly more prominently than it was last time. So I'd hope we could do that as well.